When a superpower facing its own environmental crisis begins treating a neighbor's natural resources as a solution to problems it created, you're witnessing the moment when cooperation becomes coercion. Canada's response to American water demands changed everything about how these two countries understand their relationship. I've been studying North American political relationships for decades, and I can tell you that the water crisis represents something far more significant than a resource dispute or environmental disagreement. It represents the moment when the fundamental assumptions underlying the longest peaceful border in the world were tested and found to be far more fragile than anyone had imagined. The official story, to the extent that it was covered by mainstream media, focused on technical discussions about water management and continental resource sharing, dry policy language about watershed agreements and international cooperation frameworks. But what actually happened was far more primal and far more consequential than any bureaucratic negotiation. What happened was that America, facing unprecedented drought and resource scarcity, essentially demanded that Canada treat its freshwater as a continental asset rather than a national resource. The psychology behind this demand reveals something uncomfortable about how superpowers behave when they feel their survival threatened by circumstances beyond their control. Instead of addressing the policy choices and environmental degradation that contributed to their water crisis, American leadership looked north and saw what appeared to be an obvious solution. Canada's abundant freshwater resources were right there, available for extraction, if only the proper pressure could be applied. What American policymakers fundamentally misunderstood was that water isn't just another tradable commodity in the Canadian political consciousness. It's embedded in national identity, sovereignty, and survival in ways that make it essentially non-negotiable. When the demands began flowing from Washington, the response from Ottawa wasn't just political, it was existential. Let me walk you through how this crisis developed, because the escalation reveals important truths about how alliances function under environmental stress. Initial discussions were framed in terms of continental cooperation and shared resource management. American officials spoke about North American water security as if the continent were a single integrated system rather than two sovereign countries with fundamentally different relationships to their natural resources. Canadian officials initially responded with the diplomatic language of partnership and mutual concern, but underneath the polite rhetoric was a growing recognition that this wasn't really about cooperation. This was about extraction. The Americans weren't proposing to work together on sustainable water management or joint conservation efforts. They were proposing that Canada solve America's water problem by sharing Canada's water. The moment this dynamic became clear, the entire relationship shifted. Canada had spent decades being the accommodating neighbor, the reliable partner, the country that absorbed American pressure without fundamental resistance. But water triggered something deeper than diplomatic flexibility. It triggered survival instincts that no amount of alliance history could override. Mark Carney's response was masterful in its clarity and devastating in its firmness. He didn't engage in lengthy explanations about Canadian water policy or constitutional limitations on resource sharing. He simply stated that Canada's freshwater resources were not available for extraction by foreign powers, regardless of their needs or their pressure. Canada's water belonged to Canadians, full stop. The reaction from American officials revealed how completely they had misread both the situation and the relationship. There was genuine shock that Canada would refuse what seemed to American eyes like a reasonable request for resource sharing between allies. But this shock exposed the fundamental asymmetry that had always existed but never been tested. America assumed Canadian resources were available for American problems, while Canada had never accepted that assumption. What followed was not the diplomatic compromise that both sides had grown accustomed to over decades of minor disputes. What followed was a hardening of positions that transformed the entire character of the relationship. Canada didn't just refuse the specific requests for water access. It made clear that such requests fundamentally violated Canadian sovereignty and would not be entertained under any circumstances. From an environmental perspective, this crisis exposed the limitations of thinking about climate change as a technical problem requiring technical solutions. When environmental degradation begins threatening survival, politics become primal. Countries don't respond to existential resource stress with cost-benefit analyses and international cooperation frameworks. They respond with territorial instincts and survival calculations that override decades of diplomatic precedent. The American drought crisis that precipitated these demands wasn't just a natural disaster, it was the predictable result of decades of environmental policy choices that prioritize short-term economic benefits over long-term ecological sustainability. When those choices created a crisis, the response wasn't to address the underlying causes or accept the consequences. The response was to externalize the problem by demanding that Canada absorb the costs of American environmental degradation. Canada's refusal represented something more than resource protection. It represented a rejection of the entire logic of environmental externalization that had defined American policy for decades. When Carney said Canadian water wasn't for sale, he was also saying that Canada wouldn't subsidize American environmental irresponsibility, regardless of political pressure or economic incentives. The agricultural sector provides perhaps the clearest example of how these dynamics played out in practice. American farming operations that had expanded into arid regions based on assumptions of unlimited groundwater access found themselves facing existential threats as aquifers depleted and surface water disappeared. Instead of accepting the need to restructure agricultural practices or relocate operations to more sustainable areas, the response was to demand access to Canadian water resources to maintain unsustainable American farming patterns. Canadian agricultural communities watching this crisis unfold understood immediately what was at stake. If Canada agreed to supply water for American agriculture during this crisis, it would establish a precedent that Canadian resources were available to solve American problems. Once established, such precedents become impossible to reverse when future crises arise. The energy sector followed similar patterns. American power generation that depended on water-intensive cooling systems faced shutdowns as drought reduced available supplies. Instead of transitioning to more sustainable energy technologies or accepting the need to reduce energy consumption, the response was to propose that Canadian water resources could maintain American energy production at current levels. For Canadians, these demands represented a fundamental misunderstanding of both sovereignty and sustainability. Canada hadn't caused the American drought crisis, and Canada's water resources existed to meet Canadian needs, not to subsidize American environmental degradation. The suggestion that Canadian water should be treated as a strategic reserve for American consumption was not just economically unacceptable, but politically unconscionable. The diplomatic language used by American officials during this crisis was particularly revealing. Water demands were framed as requests for partnership and continental cooperation, but the underlying assumption was that Canadian refusal was unreasonable given the severity of American needs. This framing exposed the imperial logic that had always lurked beneath the surface of the relationship, that American problems automatically became Canadian obligations. Canada's response demolished that assumption with surgical precision. Carney's statements made clear that Canadian resources existed for Canadian purposes, that sovereignty meant the right to control your own assets, and that alliance didn't mean automatic availability for resource extraction. The clarity was shocking because it had never been necessary before, but once stated, it couldn't be unstated. The long-term implications of this crisis extend far beyond water policy into the fundamental structure of North American political relationships. Canada demonstrated that there were limits to accommodation, lines that couldn't be crossed, resources that weren't available for external pressure, regardless of need or alliance history. This demonstration changed how both countries understood the relationship going forward. From a global perspective, the water crisis between America and Canada offers a preview of how climate change will reshape international relationships. When environmental degradation creates resource scarcity, the comfortable assumptions of international cooperation give way to harder calculations about survival and sovereignty. Countries that have abundant resources will face increasing pressure from countries that don't, and those pressures will test alliance structures in ways that traditional diplomacy isn't equipped to handle. For American communities facing ongoing drought and water stress, Canada's refusal represented an uncomfortable confrontation with reality. The resource scarcity they were experiencing couldn't be solved by externalizing the problem to neighboring countries. It required either addressing the underlying causes through policy changes and lifestyle adjustments or accepting the consequences of environmental degradation. The tragedy of this crisis is how predictable it was and how avoidable it could have been. If American environmental policy had prioritized long-term sustainability over short-term extraction, if water conservation had been treated as a national priority rather than a regional concern, if climate change adaptation had been planned proactively rather than reactively, the crisis that led to demands on Canadian resources might never have reached critical levels. But instead of prevention, the response was pressure. Instead of adaptation, the response was extraction. Instead of accepting responsibility for environmental choices, the response was to externalize the costs to allies who had made different choices and maintained different relationships with their natural resources. As this crisis continues to unfold, what becomes clear is that environmental pressures are rewriting the rules of international relationships in ways that traditional diplomacy struggles to comprehend. When survival resources become scarce, even the closest allies discover they have fundamentally different ideas about sharing, sovereignty, and mutual obligation. Canada's response to American water demands represents more than resource protection. It represents a model for how smaller countries can maintain sovereignty under environmental pressure from larger neighbors. The refusal was firm but not hostile, clear but not confrontational, absolute but not aggressive. It demonstrated that sovereignty doesn't require military power when it's backed by moral clarity and resource control. For observers trying to understand how the global order will adapt to climate change, this crisis offers important lessons about the relationship between environmental stress and political stability. When comfortable assumptions about resource availability and alliance obligations are tested by scarcity, the results are often surprising and sometimes transformative. The water war between America and Canada marks the beginning of that transformation, not its end.